Over the past 3 months, nearly 1 million people have had to flee for their lives in Idlib in Syria. Children are freezing to death. But does the world care? I'll ask a senior UN humanitarian official. Mark Cutts, thank you for joining me on Upfront. You're the UN's Deputy Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for Syria. Over the past 3 months there, hundreds of thousands of people have been fleeing from their homes inside of Idlib, many of them including kids freezing to death as the Syrian army advances towards them. Is anyone going to save them? Can anyone save them?
Well, humanitarians are doing their best to help these people. We've got many different humanitarian workers on the ground who've been trying to help move people away from frontline areas and try to help provide them with tents and blankets and plastic sheeting and food and other relief items. But what these people want is for the fighting to stop. They want safety, and that's what's not happening at the moment. That's where the Security Council needs to act. We have been briefing the Security Council. We've been warning them that this is coming. But, you know, humanitarians can only play their part. Political actors are also needed, and they need to stop this fighting and ensure that these civilians are protected.
I'll come back to the Security Council and those political actors you rightly mentioned in a moment. Just dealing with the situation on the ground. You say you're trying to help people get away from the front line. But the harsh, brutal reality is that there is no escape for a lot of these people, is there? Turkey, which has taken in millions of people in the past, has shut the border. So if you're a Syrian stranded in Idlib right now, there's basically a death sentence hanging over you.
Yes, what we're dealing with is a situation of 3 million people who are trapped in a war zone. These are people who are not simply fleeing, fighting between two opposing armies. This is a population which itself is under attack. They come from towns and villages which have faced systematic, wide-scale, indiscriminate bombing, airstrikes and shelling that has continued day and night. Entire cities and towns have been emptied out. And as these people have fled, many of them have been hit along the way when shells and airstrikes have landed on the routes that they've been using to try to escape. So this is a protection crisis on a monumental scale, and something has to be done.
So are you calling on Turkey to open the border, or is it impossible for Turkey to cope with another 3 million refugees, given I believe they've already taken in 4 million Syrians over the last few years?
Turkey already hosts more refugees than any other country in the world, and it hosts many more Syrian refugees than any other country, 3.6 million Syrian refugees. So most UN member states are not being heard calling on Turkey to open its borders. I think they know that if Turkey has to open its borders, the next question will be, are European countries going to be opening their borders?
And are you saying that European countries should be taking in more Syrian refugees? Because, again, European governments say that's a problem for us.
Well, the whole world needs to shoulder its responsibilities towards these people. If they cannot be protected inside their own country, then they'll have to be protected somewhere else.
The United States government has banned Syrians from entering the country. They're on a banned list. As a humanitarian who's watching what's happening inside of Syria, how do you feel about that?
What we know is that the people we're talking about are mostly women and children and elderly people. The whole world has watched the pictures over the last few weeks. These people need to be treated for what they are, civilians who are trapped in a war zone. Many people have talked about this conflict in a very politicized way. We see some of the warring parties justifying their actions in terms of fighting terrorism. But we know that there are more than 100 civilians for every fighter in the Idlib area. And these civilians need to be treated for what they are. These people need help and they need to be protected.
But you have a US government, which is obviously a big donor to the UN and to UN humanitarian relief operations, is a big player in that part of the world. You have a US president who bombed Syria a couple of years ago when his daughter came to him and said she couldn't bear to see pictures of chemical weapons attacks. You have a president who now says, you know what, I'm only there to keep the oil. He openly brags. And a president who will not take in any Syrian refugees. What's your message to the US government as a UN official?
Well, we want to see the US government take action. We want to see all of the members of the Security Council, and particularly the veto-wielding powers, we want to see them playing their role. The Security Council has really been paralyzed over the last few months and has not been able to find a solution to this crisis. But, on many occasions in the past, Security Council members have found ways to overcome their personal interests and find solutions, and we need those Security Council members now to urgently find a solution. The Secretary General has called for an immediate ceasefire, and that's what's needed now more than anything else.
You say the UN Security Council is paralyzed. What would you say to those people who say that's an understatement? Syria proves that the UN Security Council is broken. It cannot deal with a problem like Syria. It makes Syria worse than it should be. The Russians and the Chinese cast their 14th veto to block the delivery of aid to millions of Syrians recently. Surely that shows that the Security Council is not fit for purpose when it comes to a humanitarian disaster like Syria.
I don't know if it's just the Security Council that's not fit for purpose. I think, the entire humanitarian system globally needs to be looked at. Something needs to be done to ensure that if people cannot flee to another country, they will be protected within the borders of their own country.
But Mark, realistically, you have the Russian government, which is bombing these towns. You talked about systematic, widespread, indiscriminate bombing, you said a moment ago. What would you say to people who say you need to go further than that? You need to call out war crimes for what they are. You need to call out war criminals for who they are. That the UN shouldn't just be kind of equivocating at a time like this. It would be helpful if you named names and shamed the people involved. If I ask you today, Mark, you're there dealing with this tragedy, dealing with this crisis. If I say to you, you're talking to these refugees, they're clearly telling you what's been happening. Is there evidence of war crimes?
Well, we know there's lots of evidence of war crimes. We know that war crimes have been committed repeatedly throughout this.
By who, Mark?
War. Well, you know it very well, by all sides. And it's not for me to determine whether any individual act constitutes a war crime or not. That's for the courts to decide. But we do know that there have been many war crimes, and certainly there's every indication that a lot of war crimes have been committed in the last few months, including just in the last few days.
But Mark, a lot of people watching this around the world, they'll say that's true. War crimes have been committed by all sides. But right now, nearly 1 million people have fled from their homes in the last 3 months. That's not all sides. That's the Syrian government and its Russian ally.
Yes, well, we know that the majority of the civilian deaths and injuries in the Idlib area have been caused by airstrikes and shelling carried out by Syrian government forces and their allies. We know this very well, and we've been calling on all of them repeatedly. I've had meetings just this week with the Russians and the Turks and the Americans and others talking about the conflict, calling again for respect for international humanitarian law, calling for these people to be protected. We know exactly who's doing the bombing, and we are calling them out all the time. But the problem is that the bombing is just continuing.
Here's a problem, though, for the UN, and it's all very well calling out these governments. But we've known how bad Idlib could be, has been, for years. In 2018, Staffan de Mistura, then the UN Special Envoy for Syria, warned of a, quote, perfect storm looming over Idlib. They've been warning after warning after warning. So why are millions of people in this situation right now? Why are nearly 1 million people fleeing for their lives when you have experts and diplomats having warned that this was going to happen? Is it just that international organizations and governments and the people around the world just don't give a damn about Syrians anymore? They're exhausted of the Syrian conflict. There's a Syria fatigue. How do we get to this point?
Well, I think, unfortunately, that is the case, that there's a lot of fatigue when it comes to Syria because there have been so many battles and so much displacement. After all, 12 million people have been displaced over these last 9 years. But just at the time when we thought we'd seen the worst of this war, when we thought the war might be coming to an end, what we've seen is one of the worst catastrophes of the entire war. So this is not the time for people to be taking their eye off Syria. And this is not the time, for any complacency. We need concerted action by Security Council members to stop this fighting.
But what would you say to critics who say UN officials, UN organizations haven't done enough, could and should have done more over the past few years?
Right now, we're trying to scale up our operation. We've just asked for $500 million in new funding. We've got thousands of trucks crossing the border every month. We're doing a lot. But ultimately, it's up to member states of the United Nations, and particularly the Security Council members, to find the political solutions to deal with crises of this scale.
Mark, you did call for an additional $500 million to provide life-saving assistance to the people of Idlib earlier this week. You say there's a $371 million funding gap when it comes to Syrian humanitarian operations. And yet, last year, when the Notre Dame Cathedral caught fire, people were able to pledge $1 billion to help fix it in the space of 24 hours. When you hear statistics like that, how does that make you feel?
I've never been happy about the amount of funding that comes to different humanitarian operations around the world. And certainly for the Syria crisis, we actually need a lot more money than we're currently getting.
The money you're asking for is the equivalent of 2 months, roughly, of spending that the American military does on its troops in that part of the world.
So we should have no problem getting this money. And
but
yet,
you are.
We don't have all the money we need. But ultimately, we need the money, we need this political support, but more than anything else, we just want the killing of civilians to stop.
And the Syrian government, of course, says, as you mentioned earlier, well, all sides are doing horrible things. They point to rebel groups, they point to al-Qaeda affiliates in Idlib and say they're responsible for the humanitarian crisis. What do you say when you hear that argument?
Well, we know that all sides have committed atrocities in this war. We know that's been happening in Idlib recently. But we also know the statistics that have been collected by the UN Human Rights Office recently showed that 93% of the deaths in the Idlib area had been caused by airstrikes and shelling by the Syrian government forces and their allies.
Mark, last question. What you mentioned, the kind of governments having kind of failed in their obligations, not doing enough to stop the violence or to contribute money. What's your message to ordinary people watching this who are heartbroken by some of the scenes coming out of Syria? What's your message to people around the world? What can they do?
Well, I think, first of all, put pressure on your own parliamentarians, on your own governments to ensure that there's a concerted effort made to find a political solution to this crisis. But secondly, please contribute generously to the humanitarian operation. We need your support. The people of Idlib need your support.
Mark Cutts, thank you for joining me on Upfront. Good luck.
Thank you.